40th anniversary, and as part of the celebration we decided to have tonight's panel discussion. And we're going to talk a little bit about the gallery in the early days, and I think more importantly we want to address some of the changes in the field of photography in the intervening 40 years. We don't do this kind of thing very often, but then we don't have a 40th anniversary very often either. So here we are, and I want to introduce the panelists. We have 6 members who were at the gallery from the very beginning. So these are the people that started the whole thing, and I'll introduce each of them in a minute. And we also have the distinguished photo critic, A.D. Alan Campbell, who's going to model. Coleman. My apologies. A.D. Coleman. Okay. Okay, starting here, we have Mark Hayden. This is Mark, and Mark is a longtime professor of photography at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Is it? Yeah, that's right. That's it. Yeah. He was in the very first show here at Soho Photo way back in '71. Moving on, next we have LEE Romero, and known as Lee. Romero. He's a longtime photographer with the New York Times, and still with the New York Times. And as a matter of fact, this past Monday, one of his pictures was in the Times, and there was an interesting story behind it. It is the only working farm in Manhattan. Did I get that right?
Yeah, 365 years was the last farm.
So now we have a working farm in Manhattan. I'm sure that'd be an interesting story, but we'll have to save that for another time.
It's a window box on 96 Street.
Kind of how is he growing? It's a pot farm. That's what they say.
Okay, Catherine Ursillo is, that's you, right? Raise your hand. Okay. Catherine is a longtime freelance photographer. She's worked for all the major corporations, and you said you were director of photography for a chemical bank, right? Okay. And taking a seat now is Jill Freedman. Jill Freedman said this about herself, and I'm quoting, "I'm a self-taught documentary photographer. I love street shooting and making books." She said, "I see moments in books." I love that quote, "I see moments in books." I mean, that sort of really summarizes to me what it's all about for an accomplished photographer. And next to Alan, we have HARVEY STEIN, who is known to a lot of you, I guess. He's a longtime photographer, teacher, teaches at SVA and ICP, author of several books and a lot of exhibitions, etc. Okay, I think you're sick of hearing me, so I'm going to shut up and turn the panel over to Alan.
Where's Sonia?
Well,
Sonia, you're right here. What are you doing over there?
Oh, I got you on the list. Aren't you going to leave the table?
Why are you there?
Okay.
Sonia has entered the table now.
Okay, this is Sonia Katchhian. This is Sonia Katchhian, who came up from North Carolina, right?
Via Tokyo.
Oh, via Tokyo. Okay, well that's even more interesting.
Don't stick me in North Carolina.
She describes herself as a veteran photojournalist and corporate photographer. And more interesting, she says she was the first journalist kidnapped on Beirut's Green Line. I think there's a very interesting story there too, but that'll have to wait for another time. Okay, that's everything I want to say, so I'm going to sit down and shut up.
Well, hello there. We don't have a microphone, so you're all going to need to be fairly quiet. That means put those potato chip bags away, turn off your cell phones, and we're going to have to speak up here, which I think everybody in this panel can do that. So we'll talk as loudly as we can. If you have trouble hearing us, just, don't be bashful. Just shout out louder. you know, from the back there, and we'll up the volume as much as we can. I think my job here is mostly the task of herding cats, as they say. So I'm going to try to stay pretty much out of the way of the panelists and just push them and poke them a bit. But I thought I'd provide a little bit of context. I see a lot of people here are fashionably graying their hair, so you may not need this context. But I'm just going to provide a little bit anyhow, and that is that 40 years ago, when Soho Photo was founded, and that's what we're celebrating here tonight. That was really the heyday of the beginning of the alternative spaces movement in the arts generally, and in photography specifically. Artist-run co-ops of different kinds began to emerge in the late 60s and the early 70s. There had been some before that, but this was in effect a kind of a national movement or trend. And this is important for artists in all media, of course, but more so, I would say, for people in photography, because there were so few places for photographers to show at that point, not just in New York, but anywhere in the country. Photographers, and I think all the photographers on the panel will remember this, and many of you in the audience will remember this. You know, the Whitkin Gallery had opened. Light Gallery, I don't think, had quite opened. Was it open? It had just opened. Those were two commercial galleries here. There was Norbert Kleber's Underground Gallery on East, what is that, 10th Street?
That's, yeah.
Right. There was, Mark Haven just reminded me, I reviewed or showed of his at a place called the Dark Room, which was a sort of a community dark room and processing house on Avenue A and Thompson's Park. There was Joe Portagallo's lobby in his little processing house. The floating, was that open then? When this opened?
1970 anyway.
Yeah, somewhere in there. But very few, and a lot of those were basically the same kind of either alternative spaces or people kind of creating space in a library lobby or something like that. What? Well, that was before. That had been that was the 60s actually. That had come and gone. That was the kind of precursor to this. Yeah. So so the idea of there being a photographer-run space that had some actual real dimension to it, and that had the desiderata, which were track lighting, white walls or gray walls, reasonably freshly painted, and metal sectional frames. That was real. This was the sort of beginning of the metal sectional frame era, the Kulicke frame, which meant that you could actually fairly inexpensively, frame your own pictures instead of putting them up on the walls with push pins or just under glass. These were the three big, big demarcation points for photographers. So for there to be a photographer-run space like this in Manhattan, in an area that was starting to get some traffic from art goers, was a very important moment for the city. And I reviewed, I think, the first show, and I reviewed subsequent shows there for The Voice or for The Times. And I'm sure there'll be some stories coming out from people who were founding the gallery and working here. But I'll tell you one, I was not a founder. I was just sort of a watcher, right, a cultural journalist observing this. But there is one story that I can tell you, which is that one of the group shows I reviewed here had a very small portfolio, maybe 10, 12 pictures, by a young photographer I'd never, I'd never heard of, named Arno Raphael Minkinen. And in this review of a group show, I mentioned his pictures favorably in 2 sentences, a short paragraph. I mean, nothing more than that. I didn't know him at all. Arno, it turned out, was working for BBD&O as an advertising copywriter, and had the Nikon account, and they had given him a camera, and he had been fooling around with it and was trying to decide whether or not he was going to be a serious photographer. So when I met him a couple of years later at an opening at Marge Nykrug's gallery, which some of you will remember, up near Hunter, Arno told me that when that review came out in The Voice, he took the morning off from work. He went down to the local bar. He ordered himself a double Jack Daniels, and he sat there. And at the end of the double Jack Daniels, he said, "I'm going to be a photographer." So that's part one of the story. And part two of the story is that 35 years after that, roughly in 2005, his midlife retrospective opened, which I curated, and went on tour in the U.S. and Canada and in Europe. So things did happen for people as a result of being part of this gallery, and I'm sure things are still happening for people who are part of this gallery.
I have to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I saw that show at the De Cordova. It was absolutely the biggest photography show ever. Almost every piece, or every piece in the book, I think it was several hundred pieces were on display.
120 print show.
120
yeah.
prints.
Yeah.
Some of them bigger than life size.
Wow.
Very impressive.
Yeah. Thank you.
I've never heard of a Finnish photographer that would make up his mind with one double.
He was Finnish American. He came over when we fly, so maybe we saw him. So anyhow, so that's one of my probably my most exciting Soho photo stories. So I guess I want to start the panelists off not so much necessarily with their anecdotes, but with a more general question, which is that when this gallery opened, of course, the internet didn't exist. There were not many alternative ways for photographers to get their work out. You couldn't self-publish your own book in a single copy anyhow, the way you can now with Blurb or some really, really small edition. You couldn't inform people easily about your work. All of that has changed. So without suggesting that this gallery does not have a continuing life, because it obviously does, do any of you see a logic to creating a space like this today?
Yeah, always.
You should ask the members if they get value out of it.
Well, I want to start with you guys. Then we'll hear from them.
I don't know whether I don't think it would have the same relevance because I mean everybody has a web presence.
I mean, you're teaching, right? So what do your students do?
They all have web presence.
Speak up, we can't hear you.
Yeah.
They all have presences on the web.
Yeah, he's talking. Mark's talking about his students.
Yeah. I mean, I think they see that as their way of getting their work out.
And they have Facebook pages.
Yeah.
And they have Twitter.
Everything you can think of, they have. Right. And more. So I'm not. I mean, they still enjoy putting prints on a wall, but it's a different experience. I mean, the web presence has unlimited number of viewers. You never know who's going to look at it. And gallery space, maybe a couple of hundred people if you're lucky. So I think there's just they just practical. And they can carry it around with them.
So much easier to steal from the web than to take a picture of.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think also, we're not going to get into this now, but I think it's changed the way they approach photography. Make them lazy. The craft of it is now disappearing.
And don't forget boring.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the craft that everybody here grew up with is really being lost. And
well, you probably know, but Mark teaches at RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, and so I imagine Mark knows this, but the others may not. About 3 years ago, RIT officially declared gelatin silver to be an alternative process.
Oh no!
Oh yeah, yeah. That hurts, right?
So what does that mean? Did they close all the dark rooms, the black?
No,
if you want to learn black and white, you have to take
it means that they teach it along with albumin printing and collodion and cyanotype and film printing and all those